Yeah. It's not a bad turnout. Good morning. Carla, can you get these folks in order here? All right. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. Thank you for making the time to join us. It's a very busy day, very busy time for most of us, so I appreciate everybody carving out this time. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I've been informed that we're going to be somewhat low tech. The microphones are not on, so don't worry about them. Just project. And I've also been told that I have no clicker. So thank you, Courtney, for helping out there. So we'll get into the agenda here in a second. I guess just a little bit of commentary. We're mostly just touch and base. This is a very key milestone. We've got the session kicking off. There's been a lot of work that's happened since the last time we gathered. It just seemed like it was a very good idea just to kind of bring everybody up to speed. So maybe we could just hit mute there if we're on the line, please. So anyway, I want to make sure that everybody comes away comfortable with the progress that's been made, and then also there's this open question around where do we go from here, and I think that's a very much an open question as we'll see, and I guess that what I would invite all of us to participate in the creation of this agenda. I've got the agenda. It's pulled together. We do have an open period at the end, and so to the extent you've got things on your mind, want to talk about things, feel free to bring them up at the end, or even as we look at the agenda, we can make some amendments. So I guess maybe I'm saying it's a little less structured than what we've done in the past. If nothing else, I just want to make sure that we're spending some face time together. It's a short meeting. So Cordy, if we could just. Thank you. So, this. Good morning, Mayor. So if you'll turn your attention, please, to the screen back here. So this basically addresses some of the things I was just going over, just in terms of what we want to walk away with today. Number one is there has been a lot going on since the last time we gathered. A lot of preparation for the session. We also did have the mitigation committee that has continued their work. So we want to hear an update there. Want to talk about the remaining wildfire work. Remaining is kind of humorous because it's never ending. But I just want to talk about somebody, there is a proposal for this council to continue through 2021. Until that's addressed in the legislature, we don't know. But whether it's this group or somebody else, we want to go ahead and start to inventory what the next phase of wildfire work would be. Do want to talk about specific legislation for the session, and then also hear feedback and talk a little bit about engagement and how council members can support and get involved with the process. So that's what I had. And again, I'll hit pause here to see, is there anything else that we should be adding to the desired outcomes, Jason?
I don't think so. Just a little bit I think you hit it all. I think included in what you hit, the Senate Committee on Wildfire Response is meeting today I think it begins at 1 o'clock, and it is on a Wednesday schedule, anticipated to meet, certainly this week, next week, and until committees are wrapped up.
Yeah, so we're going to be migrating many of us to that, and encourage any and all of us to, if you have time this afternoon, to join in down there. It's obviously a show of support would be helpful. Anything else anybody wants to add? Peter?
No, you covered it well,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay. Courtney? So how that translates into this actually is, what am I talking about? This is probably a more structured agenda than what we've had in the past, just because it's shorter. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to take a look at this. This is basically what was emailed out. I'm going to talk a little bit about the future wildfire work that I see, ask for folks to join in on that. Joe Furia is going to give a very brief synopsis of a very lengthy 70-page report that came out from the mitigation committee. Jason's going to talk about the omnibus bill from the governor. We invited Senator Bartscheiger to talk about agency modernization. That's really his legislation, his bill, but obviously he's occupied here this morning. John's going to pitch in. Mark is going to talk about land use, Mark Bennett, Commissioner Mark Bennett, and then Stefan Bird's going to talk about transmission recommendation that's been translated into legislation. And then we're going to have Senator Golden is going to join us at 11. And we'll finally, as I said, we've got 30 minutes for open discussion and finally public comment. Any requested amendments to the agenda? So far, so good? Okay. Thanks. All right, so just in terms of level setting, kind of where we are and where we're going, 2019, very busy year. We started with executive order just barely a year ago. We held 9 meetings, a whole series of committee presentations and reports. Our last time gathering was the November 8th council report, just ahead of Ledge Days. And for those of you who could not attend, we did review all 37 recommendations, 110-page report. I'm happy to report we got unanimous approval from the voting members on all 37 recommendations. And we did that heading into Ledge Days, and we're able to carry those forward with a series of meetings at the various hearings. Many of folks around the table here participated, also with AOC, and I would say I think did a fairly good job of leveraging a lot of the champions around the table here to build support with AOC within the legislature. I want to specifically recognize Commissioner Bennett for some extraordinary work with AOC. That continues. So thank you very much, Mark, to both you and to Holly Kearns, who's just been really, really a great asset. And, appreciate your county availing, both of you, to service here. And I would just say, my general reaction is that the work of the council, whether it's been in November, December, January, I think has been very well received. I've heard one legislator comment of the best report that she had ever read, which I think is very high praise. And I think the council, through its committees, erred very much on the side of quality, to doing a very comprehensive job. I think using the national cohesive framework was very, very helpful. Haven't really had a whole lot of folks pointed to blind spots. It wasn't like I haven't seen a lot missing. There are certainly philosophical differences, which you would expect, but I don't think the council stands guilty of having, done a shoddy job here on the report. And I think that's serving the state well and has set us up fairly well for the February session. Shift into December, again, we had a 70-page mitigation report that came out. As you'll recall, the way that got framed up was that they just weren't done in time for the November 8th meeting, and so they had a chair's report that, which was very helpful for our report. They followed through with the full committee report, which it's a very good report. Hopefully everybody had a chance to read that. We had legislative concepts, legislative days, and you see the bills that we'll be reviewing. Today is meeting 10. I guess this is an official council meeting. We, sort of ran out in September, and we've been proceeding. And then we've got the session ahead of us, and depending upon how that unfolds, we'll either be extremely busy over the next few weeks or suddenly idle. And then the rest of the year really depends on whether or not we're going to get renewed to move forward. So that's kind of where we are in the timeline. This last part, and there's a lot here, but I've taken a crack at kind of a straw proposal of some of the future wildfire work to give everybody here a flavor of what would be next if we get renewed, and then also very much to invite folks around the table to chime in. Is there anything missing here? And even if you have thoughts about how workflow could get designed with committees and so forth. So I will kind of run through these, and then I'll hit pause and welcome input and feedback. I know a lot of folks around the table have been thinking about this question. So the first one, and I think I'm borrowing straight from Jason in terms of the language he always uses, which is we've pulled together a huge report, 37 recommendations, and I think all of us said at the outset, the last thing we want to see is this collect dust on a shelf. And so that does speak to monitoring to see, how are we doing on the recommendations. This is the group that formed the recommendations. Probably makes sense for this to be the group that owns those recommendations. So at least through 2021, to continue to ensure that there's attention being paid. And so I could see a quarterly work schedule. Maybe we meet, once a quarter for 3 hours and go through those recommendations and to see how are they coming together. What did we address in 2020? What's left for 2021? So that seems to be a fairly basic function. Number two, the legislative session that's kicking off right now, supporting that on an as-needed basis. Number three, related to the extent we have federal legislation, whether it's working with the shared stewardship agreement, whether it's supporting the governor of Western Governors Association, to look to, particularly with regard to mitigation funding, but also suppression resources and so forth. Also, we've seen a lot of attention here recently pick up with regard to the BLM and their fire contract with ODF. And so I could see the council continuing to play a role on all those fronts. Number four, we really have not engaged, nearly to the extent possible, just in terms of public awareness, whether it's op-eds or speaking engagements around the work of the council, the recommendations, and just building awareness for the fact that this is is one of the pivotal issues facing the state, and so I could see building out a work plan there. Number five, we've talked about this a lot, a financial plan around the cohesive strategy. We said all last year that was coming, and sure enough, I would say some of the toughest questions that we have faced in these legislative hearings is how are we going to pay for this? And how does a 2020 ask fit into a long-term plan? Because these are dynamic ecosystems. Anything you treat this year is just going to grow back over time. How do you sustain this effort? What's the long-term vision? What's the long-term plan? And so I think that's, frankly, a very urgent need. Number six, organizational design. And this is basically, who owns this cohesive strategy? How frequently is it updated? How do you drive the implementation? what's the integration with the shared stewardship agreement? What's the relationship with the Board of Forestry and ODF? Is this just simply a one and done, task group that develops a report, or should there be something that's more enduring? Number 7, identify any new recommendations. So for instance, in the suppression committee's recommendations, they acknowledged that the state fire marshal's office and the mutual aid system had not undergone the big audit that ODF had undergone, which was very helpful to those recommendations. That was an ask for something like that to occur for the broader system. I could see that potentially being work that would be, at least scoped, if not, implemented, over the course of 2020. But more generally, I don't think anybody concluded that those 37 recommendations were everything, and so there are, there's going to be future work to be done. And then ultimately, I think number 8, the governor is looking ahead to the 21 session, saying, 2020 is a short session. We're going to be ambitious. There will certainly be work left to be done in 2021, including, even if we got everything we wanted in 2020, a lot of the mitigation work is, there's a demonstration kind of aspect to it, to proof of concepts to the legislature in hopes of expanding mitigation work in 2021 and beyond. And so you could see a role for the council there as well. And then finally, I put this other to invite any questions or comments from folks around the table. I know, Russ, you're always thoughtful about these things, but others as well. So anyway, that's just kind of a straw proposal again to elicit reactions. So open it up. Yep.
As I was looking at it, we kind of left off that list and I grouped it all together, and the land use, public safety, public health component, where that we've discussed emergency management role, for instance. Obviously, the big piece of land use planning, how this integrates with the insurance industry, and then law enforcement, because they have a big piece, and looking at other wildfire reports in other states, those components. And we've addressed them in the discussions, but we didn't list them up here. As that we need to have a check-in and make sure that we didn't move on to some of the probably the more expensive ones, but that these are still occurring components that need a consistency, really, and to make sure that they're following what the council has raised the concerns. I mean, we've had discussions on each of those areas, the public health piece, the social justice piece. I guess the catch-all would be not.
Yeah.
And I haven't really crafted, but those are areas that I think we don't want to lose track of and lose momentum on.
So would you characterize those as being things that we maybe just didn't get to enough in 2019, that we need to do more drilling down? Because right now, what I've got listed up there is just kind of monitoring the existing recommendations. Are you thinking that those are areas that we need to kind of build out a little bit more?
Well, I think first and foremost we need to monitor them.
Yeah.
But then they may require build out as we discover new things, new pieces. One of in the discussions, for instance, on land use planning, is that the groups, we never discussed access, but that's a big important thing. If we don't have adequate access, the people can't get out and the fire operations can't get in. So that's something that as we move along, we need to talk about that. Water supplies, those are the kind of things, the public health issue, having filtered facilities for people to go to and identifying people with need.
Can I take a crack at a potential answer or to that a little bit? I think there was an interesting list of issues, and one in particular, I think law enforcement struck me as we may not have addressed that as much with this council as some of the others, and that sort of fell in Matt's category of maybe a new issue with new recommendations for future work of the council. Land use, health effects, social justice.
Emergency and disaster.
Yeah, I would say, thinking about it in the lens that I am suddenly immersed in of legislation and what is actually in a legislative context and what's in draft bills and what translates into legislative language. Those issues strike me as a very interesting combination of things in which we can make some initial steps that reflect the conversation that's happened here, but we certainly can't make all the steps that reflect the conversation that's happened here in a short session. And so sort of the role of the council is to see what's accomplished in 2020 off of areas where we've already talked about a fair amount, and see what's left, and if sort of that course correction and or adaptive management, that as you take one step forward, what becomes the next priority? Land use, health, social justice all strike me as those kinds of concerns or issues. And then lastly, emergency management, suppression, and mitigation strike me as a different tier of issue where we did a lot of talk about that, and we're pretty solid on what the first ask is and probably what the second ask is in 2021. That was my 20 minutes of the agenda. Just kidding.
If I may, just Senator, welcome, and I know you're incredibly busy, so thanks for joining us. So what we're doing here is I think you could add to this conversation. We're just identifying some of the outstanding kind of next phase of work, things that should the council get renewed or somebody, needs to be looking at. So I've got a straw proposal list up here, but we're also soliciting from the council members any other ideas. So. Carol?
I think this relates to both Mark and Jason's comments, and it's kind of a question I brought with me today, having known that, for instance, the Historic Protection Association just finished a series of community fire plan open sessions around the county, and I'm kind of wondering how as a council member, or even maybe just a community member, for that matter, how do we access who's tracking that? Is it ODF? Is it emergency services? How do we after we have, for instance, I would say after we've had a series of community interactions, how do we get the information that's the response of how the community responded to the wildfire plan, or to whatever, to just to the community fire plan?
Yeah, that's really good.
Douglas County is probably different than some other counties, but maybe not.
Yeah, so maybe number 4 should be, instead of us building public awareness, is also kind of a receiving their and community input as well.
Well, yeah, and who within our arms with here is kind of collecting that.
Yeah.
So would that be like a report card? So as we go along through this process, we report out, hey, okay, so here's our report, here's our progress.
Well, I don't know. I don't want it to become too much paperwork. But I think it is a report to us of what has happened. How did people respond? I think that's really where, not to discount the legislative process, but how are people, what are they saying when they come, and whoever it is that's making the presentation makes it, how's it being received?
Yeah, so for the benefit of folks on the phone, this is a really good question. How I might, characterize or broaden it a bit is that we acknowledged, because we had such a quick timeline last year, that this was a fairly, I don't want to say insular, but I mean, this was like, there's a lot of a lot of work at the committee level and the council level. We just didn't have the time or the resources to do a lot of community outreach. And so I think 2020, we're going to see more of that. And the question from Carol Whipple is, how do we then gather that community input, receive that community, process community input, and then maybe improve our recommendations based upon the community input, particularly as we look ahead to the 2021 session. I think that's a very good question.
And that's not an insignificant question that will take resources. You can try to do it heuristically or ad hoc, and you just don't get good answers. So, but there are firms out there that do this work. We have a forest value survey done for the board and in conjunction with OFRI, and there's some and so I think you want to be asking questions because you don't want to know what they're thinking. You'd like to know if this committee has moved the needle in the way they're thinking, which would be I think what we're trying to do with outreach. So I think you want to get a sense of where they are now thinking about wildfire and then measure it again. If you really want to sort of get at what is the community feel in a broad sense, or a valid sensitivity.
There might, just building on there might be an opportunity as the shared stewardship concept, kind of that umbrella, looks at engaging stakeholders across the state and how we design that, how that's designed, and ODF will be a key partner in that. The whole wildfire, what the Wildfire Council recommendations were or are, is an opportunity to share it during that time as well and gather that feedback and then we can revisit.
That's great.
What does that mean? So
Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity through the plan to engage at the shared stewardship level.
Yeah, that's very good.
Although stakeholder, I would just distinguish the public from as a different audience and stakeholders in one.
Okay, yeah.
But no, I think it's a great idea
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
Thanks.
And Mark?
So, can you have Courtney send us emails that, so we can have a
Yep.
look at that? And then, second of all, it appears pretty clearly that the Wildfire Council is going to continue. And so we're drinking from a fire hose with short term and long term. And some of this is short term and some of it's long term. And I would offer maybe we could consider waiting till the end of the session, because a lot of us are going to be involved in the bills that are going to come out. And then that will give some clear direction on some short-term things that the Wildfire Council would be saying, well, you got a role here because this bill passed and the Wildfire Council has a role here. But long-term for the 21 session, we've got some long-term thinking that we need to do for the 21 session because this bill didn't pass or it only passed partially, but yet there's still some more work to do.
Yep.
So we could identify in the short term, here's what we need to concentrate on because this is what we got out of the 2020 session.
I like it.
And then long term, here's
Yep.
what we need to do to continue the Wildfire Council's work that we didn't get accomplished. So thoughts maybe for that?
I think that's great. And then that preceding slide where we kind of build out the calendar workflow, I could see us kind of taking your approach and building that into our calendar of workflow because that'll speak to what we're trying to get done in 2020 versus 2021. Partly why we did this, all right, I wanted to have this conversation, is partly to help Jason and the governor communicate what the Wildfire Council would do if it was renewed, because legislators naturally want to know. So that's partly why we're doing this. But I think the way we would organize it is exactly what you're describing. Yes, Carla?
So Matt, as I look at this list, 4 of the items look like they're meeting related, organizational related, and design related. They're very important. 4 on the list are a real strategic focus and kind of a change in mindset that we as a council need to have to now take this to the next level. And I would put the federal and state legislative processes and public awareness and the financial plan in that category. We need to shift gears and move to a new level. But I feel like there's one missing here. And a roadmap you know, in the business world, it's who's going to wake up every morning after 2021 and own this thing and drive this plan, and making sure we have the leadership and capacity within whatever organization owns this, that we have the financial wherewithal, leadership, and capacity to truly own and drive this thing. And I think we talk around that, but I really feel like that does need discussion.
Yeah.
We've discussed that several times. I mean, who's going to be that person or organization? Because otherwise it would be.
Thanks, great. Jim?
Item number 6 a little bit.
I'm sorry?
I'm looking at item number 6 and I'm trying to listen to Carla and look at my interpretation of item number 6.
I think she's articulating better than I did what number 6 was all about. Yeah. No, I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, I think partly what Carla's getting to is that there is kind of a short-term organizational design element around the recommendations and so forth. And then there's this longer-term question around who is going to wake up every day obsessing about how do we improve our, over the long term, the state's, wildfire conditions and our strategy. So, Jim?
Well, I was just going to say on, what Carol was talking about, there's a lot of those community events that are going on, and talked a little bit about, wildfire within those communities. And there's some really strong associations that are out there, other interagency associations. And so starting tomorrow, the Pacific Northwest Coordination Group is having a fire prevention conference over at Sun River, where all of those folks will be engaged in having conversations. So one of the things I could do for this council, and I'm heading on over there for that conference, is really get from them, do they collect this information as a group? Because a number of them are chairs on the regional group, which is the 10 federal and state agencies in both Oregon and Washington. So there might be somebody that's already out there at least capturing when these events are occurring, and they can share that information with us, what they're really hearing back, so that we're looking to those folks to gather information instead of us. So I'll see if there's a process in place and something that can kind of streamline it and bring it back to the community.
Yep. So, thank you. I know Senator Frederick, you had another?
Well, I wanted to say something to Carol and some of the comments. Don't give the legislative system too much credit on monitoring. We simply don't do it well. I mean, it's something that we need to be able to do, and that is one of the issues that I keep running into whenever I'm talking with folks in my district or outside of my district. The real concern about who's going to be watching to see whether we're actually doing the things that we say we're doing, and that's on all ends of the spectrum. You have folks who are convinced that that parts of what we have created here are designed to clear cut the forest, and then you have folks who are on the other end of the spectrum who believe that what we've designed here is to stop everybody from going into the forest. Neither are true, but we need to have the ability to monitor what in fact we are doing and be able to present that to the general public and watch how we handle that. That's not necessarily something that the legislative branch can do, but we need to be able to do it. That's a key element for the credibility of this program, and that's what I'm trying to look at, how we can make sure that we build some credibility in terms of how we're going to do things at the state level in dealing with wildfire and other issues.
Great. So Linda, I'm actually 10 minutes past. I'm failing as chair to keep us on the agenda here. So let me suggest this. I think I am actually reminded that I should have included on this list that we actually did have an interagency communications effort that we had teed up that we need to follow through on as well. And I think that's just part of, one of the dominant themes here, and thanks, Carol, for raising this, is just communications. It is building public awareness, but also gathering input from stakeholders and the community. And so I hear that as being a very major theme. I'm going to try to get us a little bit back on the agenda, but I will also invite everyone please email your any continued thinking here. All right, so
One point,
Yeah.
I need one thing clarified.
Yep.
You referred to the cohesive fire strategy.
yep,
That's not the recommended, 20-year plan in the recommendations. That's the actual cohesive plan.
you're talking about the the doc. So the way I'm talking, way I'm referencing this is I just want to be clear that any kind of a 20-year plan that we examine, I think we have a habit of kind of, when we hear about 20-year plan, we typically shift immediately to fuel reduction and forest management and rangeland management and so forth. And I think that I just want to keep us focused on the broader cohesive, which would include suppression, include health and community adaptation. So as we're looking at our longer term plan, it does need to encompass all of those.
Under the existing
Yeah.
cohesive program. I just wanted to clarify.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Should I stand here?
Great.
All right. All right, so Joe Furia, Chair of the Mitigation Committee. As Matt mentioned, we delivered that final report in December after the council's report went out. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to hit this at a very top level. There is a 70-page report that involved a lot of wordsmithing, which I could not do in the, how much time do I have now?
Take your time.
40 seconds.
No. I think we have 30 minutes of kind of open discussion at the end. I think, frankly, we just had some of that, so we can eat into that. So take the time you need.
Okay.
15 minutes.
All right. So just to remind folks, this image is different from the other one. This is the remind us when we came out in September. This was looking at the qualitative risk assessment that put together by a number of agencies led by the U.S. Forest Service, and then looking at the top 4 risk classes and then applying them to the Huck 10 watershed in Oregon. We had that presentation back in September, and that's incorporated in the report. So the 70-page report also includes appendices, so about half of that is appendices, including the September report and all the information that went into this, or summary of it. So, I'm going to speak to the report real quickly. I'll do a quick sort of cliff notes of where some of the 2020 legislative bills overlap with the recommendations of the council. Of the committee. We provided that chair's report back when the council put together its recommendations, so it's not that surprising, but it's sort of helpful to see those things in bills. And then there's a big aspect of that report is not providing the answers. It's providing a summary of the issues, because there's some much bigger organizational, financial issues at stake when you're looking at 5.6 million acres requiring treatment at a general estimate of $4.1 billion. And those things the committee is very familiar with. So, next slide. Okay, next. The agenda is built around the outcomes. So, quick reminder, the membership of the committee was 26 members. These folks were highly experienced in forest restoration, forest treatment, academic, NGO, and industry backgrounds. We had 7 committee meetings and 2 work group meetings between May and December. Anyway, I put more detail into this than I'm going to cover, so I'm sure this will be posted so you can go back and look at this, but this is just really sort of tracking the progress over time and with the final report. Next slide. So just sort of a breakout, there are 37 recommendations in the council report. Well, there's 48 recommendations in the mitigation committee report alone. And some of those recommendations involve big issues that aren't fleshed out. So there's a lot of areas to cover. There's actually
a large amount of consensus amongst the committee members around what the major issues were. The question was, how could we answer some of these sort of things that were relevant in a 2020 legislative session, when a lot of these things are going to take multiple years to address in terms of organizational reform. And so that's a big part of these issues, and these opportunities and trade-offs that are covered in the report. And then in terms of the appendices, there's 12 different land categories that are covered in some of the jurisdictional considerations. And that was an important area of complexity that the committee felt that council should be able to refer to. And then I'll also refer to, there's a crosswalk where we took the recommendations in the council report and then provided the page numbers in the mitigation report that would be relevant to those council recommendations. And then lastly, this just came out of the U.S. Forest Service and was provided as part of our report, which is there's 2 million acres that are NEPA approved in Oregon alone for treatment on federal land. It was interesting how hard it was to find out exactly where those acres were. So if you're looking at where their high priority areas are underneath the qualitative risk assessment, you're saying, okay, we want to treat those high priority areas. You're saying, okay, a percentage of those are on federal land. Okay, which ones are shelf ready? So that sounds like it should be easy to do, but it's actually, that data exists in a lot of different areas. So that map sort of helped to look at that map. You can look at the QRA, you can kind of say, okay, where's the low hanging fruit? Next slide. So there's 7 recommendation areas. I'm going to just summarize real quickly each one. We split those between sort of short-term recommendations really aimed at the 2020 legislative session, and then the mid-long-term, which were generally things we thought were going to take more time and more processes, but were important to clarify. So the first section really goes into the risk mapping. This gets into your academic science debate, when the devil's in the details. Just a reminder, the council set out sort of 10 overarching objectives. Because we're using off-the-shelf analysis in the qualitative risk assessment, it basically speaks to 6 of those 10 objectives. Sort of 4 objectives where there was not sort of consensus around what the data was as built into the QRA. The QRA is, again, led by the U.S. Forest Service. The aim is to update it every 3 years. They're going into an update process, and part of our recommendations was to include data that was relevant to those other 4 objectives, for example, public health concerns. The second area of the recommendations is really around landscape delineation. This is recognizing the fact that even within those high-risk areas, how you plan and implement treatments varies significantly across. We put into 3 sort of land classes, sort of the wild-urban interface, the actively managed wildlands, and then the reserve wildlands. This is important when folks want to say, okay, it's all about clear cutting, wilderness areas. No, that's not what we're talking about. But this type of split between across these 3 areas, this may exist in some people's mind, but it's actually not formalized in terms of thinking about forest treatment. And I think that's an important thing to consider. And then we talked in the council around the complexities of having multiple definitions of the wild-urban interface and some of the challenges that represents, because that's not just a land use consideration, it's also a mitigation consideration. So fire and smoke tolerance. There's existing community resilience programs, which the committee recommended that they be funded more, and a lot of around prescribed burning, which is sort of a major tool that the committee was really speaking to, and the fact that there's a number of barriers to even getting at scale with that, and recognizing what those barriers are and addressing those barriers. More mid-long term, this looks across a big part of this in terms of treatment is, reality is you're going to have fire, you're going to have smoke, whether it's prescribed fire, whether it's unplanned ignitions, and especially in the case of treatment, the concern is around public health and safety. That's why you're doing the treatment, but in the short term, there's considerations around smoke management. And when we looked at the availability of data and the sort of cross discussion between those 2 areas, there's a lot of area for improvement. And then I just want to put out a wrinkle. A lot of fire in Oregon is not just on forest land, it's also on rangeland. We covered rangeland in our discussions. In those cases, a lot of it is around sort of suppression and fire breaks and dealing, sort of planting native seeds, and it's a little different characteristics, but it exists in sort of a vacuum. Really the only place where this is really talked about is really around sage grouse, a lot of those activities. We were lucky enough that we had some cross-pollination between our committee and those efforts. But the reality is that there is no SSA, the Shared Stewardship Agreement, with the BLM. And there isn't sort of coordination between a lot of those activities, and there's real need, because fire on the landscape, folks remember back 5 years ago, some of the largest acres that were burned were out in the rangelands. A lot of those are private, and there's also public. So I just want to mention that there's an important wrinkle that's often not spoken to. And there also will be some things in the report there. I meant there's a smoke pattern analysis and some of the stuff coming out of US EPA. We were adding things in that were coming out literally the same months that we were meeting. So there's some latest information in there. So, next slide. All right, so the cross-ownership work, remember, I think the number is 55% of all the high-risk acres are on federal land. The next highest category of land ownership is actually private non-industrial land, and the smallest segment is state land. So there needs to be a lot of cross-ownership work. These often are managed in vacuums according to land ownership, different agencies. There is a lot going on, but it's not necessarily coordinated. This really gets at sort of a need around coordination and tools for coordinating those investments, agreements, MOAs.
So Joe?
Yeah.
Just because I know we're going to lose the center here in about 5 minutes, I've been warned. On that prior slide,
Yeah.
Something that on this cross-ownership work, I mean, one of the major issues that's already being raised is, and it's more of a philosophical question around to what degree should various landowners be expected to fund treatment on their own properties versus to what degree should the state be using taxpayer dollars to fund on non-state lands, whether it's federal lands or whether it's on private lands. And then, so again, that's a pretty, I think, very significant philosophical discussion. And further, there's a time dimension to that, which is to say, okay, there might be a long-term aspiration towards full self-sufficiency. We've got this crisis underway right now, so should the state be making investments today on federal lands and so forth with an eye towards, federal self-sufficiency in the future, or to what degree should we be expecting the state to be making these investments long term? I know that this is a debate that's going to play out through the legislative process like this week, because we are contemplating state funding on non-state land.
It is a basic, as you said, it's a basic discussion. I think that I wish I had my other colleagues, legislative colleagues here, because this is the kind of conversation that we need to be having. We aren't yet, and you don't want to come at it necessarily from a dogmatic perspective, but that's where it may come from, and so we've got to figure out how we're going to work through that. And again, I wish my other colleagues were here to get that everyone's running around right now. This morning is crazy. But I would ask that you bring this up with the other legislative colleagues that you're dealing with, because we need to figure out something that's going to be effective and accepted by folks who are not in the metro area in my district. They're not concerned about that in one way. I mean, they're concerned about the smoke issues, but they're not concerned about the who's going to be doing what and who's going to be paying for what.
I think one thing that came out of the committee discussion on this is, there's a lot of strings to pull here. And part of what the committee did, and one reason why we took so much time, was there was a lot of pulling the issues apart. And what you see in that is that there's a breakdown around how we address fuels treatment. It starts all the way at the very top in terms of appropriations at the federal level, and goes all the way down in terms of how we track implementation and what's getting done on the ground, how things are contracted, how roads are managed, all those pieces, and the lack of connectivity going up and down. And so, there's of course there's a discussion around a need for a change in funding at the very top, but there also is huge organizational issues that go all the way down that this committee kept on running up against, because there's a number of people that have tried for years to scale this up and have run into these issues. And the people that they're having direct connection with were not necessarily the people responsible for that part. So there's this sort of piece where you raise these issues and, well, that's not my area. And so I think we've spoken to earlier, the need to have sort of that just a common lexicon and then a common set of goals and metrics is a huge part of CLs. So next slide. Which is part of the management efficiency and capacity. It's not just about capacity, it's about contracting. In the case of rangelands, it's around the whole sort of restoration industrial complex that needs to be built out around sort of restoring those rangelands. And the need of private sector cooperation. There's a lot of discussion around just the nuts and bolts of contracting and reality in terms of the number of people involved in that contracting and doing the projects, but how that's being contracted. And the difference between, frankly, a forest restoration contract versus just a timber volume contract. And just for the county folks, we especially touched on the realities in terms of some of the characteristics of those four counties in terms of county things. But a big part of this is we focus on what the state can do. So this was really the short term was really around advocating for federal mitigation funding and capacity. Next slide. So the 20-year strategic financial plan. Newsflash, we did not deliver a 20-year strategic financial plan. But what we did was we characterized, okay, if you were looking at in the short session and you were trying to fund with the existing capacity, what could you do that would put you on a pathway? And then sort of characterized the key pieces that you need to have in a strategic financial plan. There was a recognition in the room that we didn't have the people in the room that really could build out that organizational and financial plan. Look at the variety of existing revenue streams, what those trends are, what those shortfalls are, what are the additional opportunities for additional tools. Folks knew about it, but there wasn't the time or the expertise in the room to really build that out. But it's a huge issue when you sort of say, okay, I'm not just measuring inputs, dollars spent, but reduction in fire risk on the ground. We touched on some of these, and a lot of these slides end up in some different bills. Next slide. And this is what I was talking about. These are all things that would need to be addressed in a larger strategic financial and organizational plan to really get at that 5.6 million acres in 20 years. That doesn't exist anymore, and there's a huge need to show how it will all add up. And we already touched on this. This is really around metrics. There are different definitions of acres treated. There's a lot of examples of acres treated, which, yes, the planning says go in and do commercial thinning and then go in and do your restoration. But a lot of times the commercial stuff happens and the restoration work doesn't happen because it doesn't pencil. And so that is acres treated, but it's not fully treated. So that's an example of sort of common metrics and common lexicon that when it breaks down, it's very hard to look across land ownerships and say, where are we today? and where do we need to be, and what's the rate of treatment to get us there. So there was a lot of example of that. There's been some work done, it just hasn't run through across all the different responsible agencies. There is some discussion around performance-based metrics too, condition-based metrics for measuring forest health. That's included here. It came out of OSU. I think it's also an important thing to take a look at. So in the appendix, this is Appendix D. Again, this is just an example. This is a few pages long, where you would have a recommendation from the council, it would have a page number, and then you can go back, and this is where we touch these things within the committee recommendations and the page numbers. So if you want to kind of, again, you didn't have the final report before you did the council report, you had the chair's report, but a lot of pieces were in it. And so you can go back and see how we spoke to those recommendations. Next slide. All right, so we've got 2 minutes here. You will have representatives speak about their own bills, so I'm not going to do that for them, but this is just a slide in which you see a lot of these things were covered in the governor's omnibus bill, and I refer to where they're spoken to in the mitigation report. Next slide. Same with the forest restoration bill, which has these pilots, talks about eco-ready acres, covers a lot of these pieces. Next. And then the ODF agency modernization, again, it talks about the need to build out ODF capacity and in the militia structure, having full-time folks who can do both sort of firefighting in the fire season and then also work on forest treatment in the off-season. Next slide. And this is what I should spend most of my time on, but I covered briefly, is there are some significant issues, opportunities, and trade-offs in all of this that committee members felt that they could highlight, but they really was outside the scope because it's not just Oregon, it's fed, it's private, and we wanted the council to go in clear-eyed on thinking about these issues when dealing with forest treatment. Next slide. This is the last slide, which again I spoke to about all. This is just an example of just how when you try to break down all the acres that need to be treated, they have all different ownership, all different jurisdiction, and then trying to go in. We actually tried to go and say, okay, well, how many acres are treated? How many acres need to be treated? And the lack of data across all those just sort of evidence the fact of the difficulty in coordinating all this. Next slide. Yeah. All right, so that was the whirlwind.
It's good. Carla, did you have?
Joe, just a quick question. You talked about the 2 million acres of NEPA approved. What was the crossover between those 2 million acres and your highest priority acres that needed treated? If you laid those maps on top of each other, what kind of crossover did you have?
So the interesting thing is those exist in 2 different data sets, and we did get to get them blended. You can look at it visually. I think anecdotally you can look at that, and there is some crossover. And there's a lot that's not, and I think the reality is that some of those areas that have been most debated from a NEPA perspective are also areas that have high fuel loads because they've been NEPA debated, so they haven't been treated. And so you do have a lot of areas where you don't necessarily have the NEPA done, but you have high risk. Remember the QRA with the 28 values, which were not weighted evenly, but people in buildings got the highest value. So there are areas, the high value areas are often in those, there's a lot of it's in Southwest. You've seen that.
But Joe, of the 2 million acres, is it 200,000, 500,000? I mean, what?
I don't have that number. Okay. There is a substantial number of acres that have gone through NEPA on federal land.
Yeah, Russ.
Back to the question here, from the lens of health and human safety, I don't believe the NEPA ready acres went through that filter.
Nope.
Is that correct?
So the NEPA
ready projects throughout the state were not designed around protecting health and human safety.
Well, that's the whole point, is that the QRA did this after the fact, and so they're separate. And so unfortunately, we don't have that much overlap.
Yeah. But I mean, the NEPA ready acres, I think I'll let the U.S. Forest Service speak to which acres they run through. But those are acres that are ready for treatment. But
Might not be
it's
priority.
very different than, and in fact, I think in a lot of cases, because of those areas that would be debated for treatment, they not necessarily through the NEPA, they would be close to where people live, and so they're not NEPA ready. But there are a substantial number. I don't have the number off the top of my head.
Jason, did you have?
I was going to ask two technical questions, but I think I might wait until the end or grab you offline. Yeah, keep this on the agenda.
So yeah, so we'll get back onto the agenda here. I do want to say, Joe, just to you and your full committee, phenomenal work, and just some very, very difficult issues, long overdue. And the fact that your committee stayed together and hung with it through these very difficult discussions, just incredible contributions. So thank you. And I think linking this back to the prior discussion around what's the outstanding work for the next phase, a lot of it is building upon these issues that have been identified by the committee, including incorporating them into a long-term strategic financial plan. So thanks, and we'll have an opportunity for further discussion at the end. So
Thank you.
yeah, thanks, Joe, very much. All right, so Jason, are you next?
Great. Yeah, I think I'm next, and I will. I have a lot of information to cover, so I might be staring at paper for a lot of this, a lot of the time that I spend speaking, and I apologize for that. But I will try and go through it and then answer any questions at the end. So we prepared a governor's omnibus wildfire bill based on the Wildfire Council's recommendation. I think during that time, there were during the time that the governor was preparing bills, there were several ways to approach the Wildfire Council recommendations. And just for background, ways that we discussed were, while the governor could focus on agency modernization, as it is sometimes being called, of all state agencies. So we did a lot of talking in this room about ODF, OSFM, Office of Emergency Management, Department of Land Conservation and Development, Oregon Health Authority, and others. And the bill could have focused all on structural aspects of state agencies. We also talked about a bill that might have been equity focused, that looking at the work that the council did and some of the conversation that happened in the council around how you could elevate equity concerns around wildfire, and that would be the governor's bill. Ultimately, what we chose as the governor's proposed legislation was an omnibus bill, reflecting that this council took a holistic, cohesive approach. So ultimately, almost the intent was, and I am saying this largely to reflect to everybody who worked so hard on this, where did your work go in this legislation? Every council recommendation that had a legislative component, we sought to have a home in the governor's omnibus bill. So
If I could just interject, just of the 37, I don't know, I'm going to say roughly 15 might have had some sort of a legislative aspect. So many others were more kind of agency operations and so forth. Those will still require monitoring, but they did not have a real legislative home.
So there may be, I think some of the questions that Matt has fielded and perhaps that my intro can help answer is, there may be recommendations in the Wildfire Council report that you don't see in the legislation, and that's largely they either didn't have they may not have had a legislative component. That's one potential answer to any question like that. So the original legislative concept was LC 83. That was converted into Senate Bill SB 1536, I think a week and a half ago. Keep in mind the section numbers, if you are tracking these things, the section numbers don't necessarily align between LC 83 and SB 1536. SB 1536 is the only thing you need to pay attention to nowadays as the governor's wildfire bill. And that bill is really, it is a big bill. As you said, 15 or so of the recommendations. It is intended to lay out the platter of work ahead of us, both to take a first step in 2020, but also to frame the conversation for 2021. So I think we fully anticipate that we have had a robust conversation so far, and we will have a robust conversation in this legislative session about what's in 1536, what must we do in 2020 to help with the 2020 fire season, what must we do in the 2020 legislative session to help with the 2020 fire season, what can we do in the 2020 session that will queue us up to be better positioned in the future in general, what can wait to 2021. So I am acknowledging, I think, that it is over-inclusive of what must be done in 2020 currently, but not that much, and we intend to have that conversation or continue that conversation. I will run through SB 1536 is on OLIS, the Legislative Information System. You can all access it. It's about 16, well, I have forgotten at this point how long it is. It is shorter than you might expect, but denser than you might expect. 16 pages with some 26 sections. I will run through the sections just briefly and give a high-level overview of what's in them. And I should say that from the first draft, there are already proposed amendments submitted, and I expect that there will be further amendments submitted based on our conversations with the legislature as we go forward. The first section is utilities. The way that the utilities section roughly lines out is that utilities prepare wildfire risk reduction plans, that those wildfire risk reduction plans are risk-based, and utilities approach it differently depending on the degree of risk in their service area, that they are flexible and designed to be flexible to reflect some of the testimony heard here by the council, and they are reviewed by the PUC, and the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, provides feedback as to how those plans may be changed to better address wildfire risk reduction. That's my broad overview of the utilities section. That section has received a lot of work, and I anticipate it will still receive some work going forward. Land use. The land use section largely charges DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, with being the home for our consolidated wildfire risk map. We talked a lot about the need for standardization in mapping, and identified DLCD as responsible for that map and responsible for providing technical assistance to local governments to produce land use plans to help reduce wildfire risk. Insurance is the next, actually it didn't get its own section, it was a sort of a subcategory under land use in the original bill. And I will just say that insurance is probably one of two areas that gets the greatest change, or that we have recognized the need for the greatest change in recommended amendments. If you read 1536, you will see that it currently says insurance, the insurance commissioner shall require insurance providers to consider wildfire risk in plans. It's overly prescriptive in the way that it was initially drafted. The amendment recommendation that has already gone in indicates that providers may consider wildfire risk in plans in providing insurance, and in assessing risk. Essentially, allowing for that to be a consideration.
So Jason?
Yes.
Is that amendment in the OLIS itself already?
It's not in OLIS. It will be by Thursday.
The only reason why I ask is because the industry, they're like bats flying around at night. One of the few things that gets them excited is that sort of shall order kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I can be helpful along that if I can get like a pre-copy or
Great.
and kind of put some fires out so I can get them back on board.
I can provide you a
That
pre-copy.
would be incredibly helpful. Thank
And
you.
now, what I provide you will be what I gave to drafting, and drafting is always
I
its own.
won't share it. I will just copy and Eric keys, and they understand that already.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Defensible space is the next section, a really important section actually. A lot of what we talked about was the need for improving the state's approach to defensible space. And that is largely manifests itself as a charge to the Oregon State Fire Marshal and staffing for the Oregon State Fire Marshal to provide support for defensible space, and a recognition of coordination and sort of coordination with local governments to work around defensible space issues. There is a significant increase in staffing at the fire marshal to afford them the ability to work with local governments and local jurisdictions to address defensible space. Building codes. Building codes appear in the draft. In the recommended amendments that I submitted over the past several days, I believe that the building codes work probably is the kind of work that we may want to wait until a longer set to the 2021 session to address more fully. There are elements of building codes that come into land use and elsewhere, so those will, I think, be subject to conversation in 2020. But ultimately, some of the larger building code adoption work, how the state works with local governments, that may wait until 2021. The next section is health effects. That is Oregon Health Authority establishing, and this is an interesting question for the Wildfire Council ultimately. There is a task force established to help administer smoke mitigation grants, and those are meant to be grants for air filtration systems to residences and commercial structures that are structured to benefit underrepresented or underprotected communities, and that's developing the characteristics or developing the criteria how you would assess where those mitigation funds should be spent. We felt that needed a task force. I think that was a recommendation directly from OHA, but ultimately that was a little bit of the work that Mark has addressed, and I wonder how going forward we might talk about how the Wildfire Council and a future task force around that might interact. Next section is emergency management. In that section, the OEM, the Office of Emergency Management, is charged with adding essentially wildfire as a emergency. They assess that will be 6 positions nested within OEM that work regionally, that do pre-preparation, mitigation planning with local governments, mitigation planning within state government to better prepare communities for when wildfire does happen. The last several sections are some of the meat of where we have spent more time talking as a council. The section that what we had called mitigation shows up as a banner in the 1536 bill as treatment program. And I think that it lays out the vision that this council really set of a need for a large amount of Oregon's forested acreage and rangeland acreage to benefit from the kind of treatment that Joe just laid out. That section is ambitious. I think it puts a pretty direct charge to the Department of Forestry and to the programs like the Good Neighbor Authority program to do that work. Because of the nature of drafting, it does not include specific positions or a specific funding amount, but I anticipate that it will be a significant increase in the pace and scale of work on mitigation through ODF, but also potentially through other agencies that do landscape mitigation work within the state government. The next section is protection of land. That's ramping up. That's what we called suppression within the committee work, ramping up the suppression work both at ODF and again at Oregon State Fire Marshal. That too, because those are existing programs, it does not identify how many people will be brought on to do suppression work. In some ways, I feel like the bill, I feel like the bill speaks least to the recommendations of the suppression committee, but that is not because the bill is overlooking that. That is because in working on the policy language, this bill couldn't include, that will be a budget ask. or associated with these sections of the bill, but it could not specifically identify a specific number of people in existing programs at ODF, just because the policy work can't be commingled with the funding work in a single bill, according to the drafters. That's what they told
Makes
me.
sense to me.
Last three sections. The bill charges that there be developed an independent, that there be a study of what assets are protected by our wildfire protection programs, and who and how are they paid for. And I think points to an independent contractor to do that work. That has come up already today in this conversation, and is a critically important part of going forward, and ultimately of something like that, of a 20-year financial plan. Who pays? How is it paid for? What does it protect? And how do our neighboring states do it? And ultimately, I think we have had extensive conversations within the House that an independent contractor is probably one way to move that conversation forward. The last two sections reference joint partnerships, just an acknowledgement that we work closely with the U.S. Forest Service. And lastly, the Wildfire Council, and the bill speaks to a continuation of the Wildfire Council to do the kind of work that earlier presentations lined out. I said last, there are a couple of structural sections, captions, and emergency declaration at the end.
So let me suggest this from a process standpoint. Thank you, Jason. We're going to pick up on a lot of these elements in the ensuing discussions, because a lot of them are being picked up by Senate and House committees. And then, so if there's any remaining questions for Jason or any of the other presenters, we've got some time at the end, if that makes sense. So
I'm going to say two more quick things, and I have to step out for a 10:30 meeting briefly. One, challenges you might encounter. OLIS, the information system, summarizes our bill very oddly. It's summarized solely as a utilities bill because it just peels off the first section. So it's very hard to find. People are confused. The press was confused. Don't be confused. It is not solely a utilities bill. Second, we are up at a little after 2 o'clock in the Senate committee, and the governor will be testifying on 1536. I think those are the only two things I mentioned.
okay, thanks. John, are you up?
Yes.
So this next bill that John's going to review has actually been forwarded by Senator Bartscheiger. So Senator is busy this morning, so John is going to fill us in on its elements.
Hey, Matt, could I get Jason before he leaves the room, just a quick question, just to the previous point about when these things are felt. We're really not talking about anything in this short session that will have a material impact on anything in this calendar year, right? Just in terms of how we should think about it and explain to others in the fire season.
I think we are talking about things that will have a material impact on the 2020 fire season. I think we all obviously need to be, maybe the word is careful in talking about how mitigation investments might affect the landscape. It is unrealistic to think that specific mitigation on the ground will reduce fire risk in 2020. But we are talking about ramping up capacity so that we won't be another year behind by the time 2021 rolls around for mitigation work. We are talking about making investments in suppression, emergency management, fire marshal that do make a difference in the 2020 fire season.
And so those things will get before July 1st.
Hope so.
Yeah, Russ.
To that specific point, will defensible space funding hit the ground before this fire season to the counties?
I'm not confident that defensible space funding to the counties will hit the ground before this fire season, but I think the capacity, I am hopeful that the capacity at Fire Marshal to begin developing the capacity to assist counties will be hitting the ground before that.
Mike through Bear Church, but we'll talk about that.
Great.
Thank you, Jerry.
Hi folks, John Audley. I'm going to do,
Yeah.
I don't project well, so. I'll do three things. One, remind everybody that as a native Kansas City and Kansas City Chiefs play in the state of Missouri, not Kansas, despite confusion created by others. So anyway, I had to do that. I was alive when... Pardon?
Was that this weekend?
Yeah. I was around when Len Dawson took the Chiefs to victory in the Super Bowl IV, so it was kind of cool last night. Anyway, second thing, I'll, at risk of doing something that people in my line of work never do, I'm going to characterize a senator's bill. And then I'll lay the foundations for the presentations by Mark and Stefan as we talk about kind of the issue Curtis raised about, so what do you do with Senate Bill 1536 and how do we make things happen, okay? And I share that from the perspective that in that sense, I am lobbying these things on behalf of a handful of folks. So I am in this building to advocate for Senate Bill 1536 and all the other bills that are related specifically to the Wildfire Council recommendations, narrowly speaking, okay? All right, so 1516 crosses, and I'll give a little kind of cross-referencing as was done earlier, but cross-references to Wildfire Council recommendations 17, 18, and 23. So you can see where that bill is embedded in the recommendations that you all presented to the governor. It is part of three bills that Senator Golden's committee and Senator Berchiger is the co-chair are introducing this afternoon. In an agreement between the two senators, Senator Golden wrote two of the three, Senator Berchiger wrote the third. I'm presenting the third of the three bills. It has three specific goals, again, directly related to the council's work. The first one is to kind of set a framework to examine the Department of Forestry under the context of forest modernization. I think importantly to a discussion that's been going on, it speaks directly to fire suppression, but it also says other activities that are related to fire suppression, which opens the door to other activities related to fire suppression, from mitigation to arguably defensible space. I'm being real careful, don't want to overinterpret. It's his bill, certainly not mine. And I'm pretty sure he's already thinking about the things he's going to do to change it. So, but that's an important component of the bill, speaks directly to your recommendations. The second then is literally the boots on the ground piece. And he identifies, was it 50? 50 seasonal positions. So take seasonal firefighters, make them full-time employees, give them broader responsibilities related to fire suppression and other things that affect fire suppression. So again, I don't know, Russ, whether or not that opens the door to defensible space. In the mind of a humble lobbyist, it kind of does, but you never know what's going to happen in 30 days. The third section speaks very narrowly to aging equipment and the need to modernize our equipment with a specific reference to aviation. So those are the three aspects of the senator's bill. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Hi, Alan.
I guess I got a question there, this to Peter. The relationship between the state and getting on, I call it boots on the ground, the associations, varies by areas of the state. And I know Joe was kind of quoting at this a little bit in his mitigation plan. And the question is, as we have these resources at the state level, which is what I would call project level, and when you look at suppression and the initial response, are we beefing that up at the association? Well, I'm looking at more future structure than I am dollars. I'm trying to understand where we're headed between the state and the boots on the ground.
So we're probably the last western state to run its own incident management teams, and that aren't dependent on other agencies or multi-agency teams. The advantage that gives us is we're not in the national system, we have access to the national system, and the severity resources allow us to control our resources. Where that's particularly critical is as you get into more intense fire season, national resources become scarce. Then you're subject to a national priority system and a state priority system, they do a really good job with prioritization, don't get me wrong, and we participate in it. I think one of the things Senator Berkshire is trying to address is twofold. It's harder to continue to get people on contract crews that are, where you have a 20-person crew with 20 hard-working individuals. You know, you might have 10 and 10 others and a lot of turnover. And so I think he's trying to address the future of our ability, plus it would give us some additional resources that we control for the whole fire season.
But basically, we're dealing at the project fire level.
That's correct. It's not at the large fire. It doesn't address the issues we talked about in this group at the large fire level. Yeah, they can't do finance. I mean, these are the real boots on the grounds. You know, after years of experience, maybe they can get them training, they can do finance or aviation or something other than, you know, these are the ground crews that.
I guess what I'm concerned, you know, the objective has been, what, 95, 96% containment of fires before we have our project fires at 4 and 5. And I guess I'm concerned about the idea of maintaining a force on the ground at the local level. Again, this gets into mitigation, but we're not speaking to that. And whether or not that's something down the road, or is that containment what we're talking about here?
Well, I think there could be a real synergy between the mitigation program and the ability to, we're already doing that where we, without any, well, with the small amount of state funding we have, plus GNA funding, we tend to extend 5-person crews to do service work for the Forest Service for fuels reduction. And that improves the quality of those employees. I think we're hoping to have some crews full-time, which then becomes a recruitment pipeline for us. So I think it does work better, not only if they're focused on mitigation out of fire season, but that they're also paid. Right now, a lot of that work is being paid by the federal government under GNA. So that's where the partnership and additional state money would add capacity to allow us to do that. Is that no?
I don't want to talk about taking too much time.
Yeah, but I think Alex raising the point that this is not solving early detection, rapid response, except for the element of equipment prioritization. But the early detection, rapid response capacity at the local community level is not being addressed by these 50 FTEs.
Oh, no, those are our ground and pounds. Those are guys that haul hose and get on a fire real quick. So it isn't aviation that actually catches a fire. It is ground crews.
It is initial attack.
We would use them for initial attack. It depends on when you're in the fire season as to whether they're a limit right now. Right now, it's only when we get into the big fire season that crews become limited for initial attack.
And I think, I can't speak for the senator either, but I think that by having them as permanent employees outside of fire season, they would be available to go out and assist private landowners with mitigation type stuff.
Right.
Mark, that's what I'm trying to get at, is at the local level, do we have the ability for private landowners? We talk about all this defensible space laws and stuff. Who's going to do the work? Joe spoke about that here earlier, and I know that's something we've got to do down the road, but is that a combination of initial attacks and also helping that small landowner to get those space cleaned up, et cetera, during the season? I think that's a
No, I think that's the key point, is that, frankly, our council, if I had to do it all over again, a lot of this came up through the suppression committee, and it was therefore viewed as suppression resources, when in fact I think more agency modernization and agency capacity is the better way to couch it, because once you actually look at the suppression committee's report, huge portion of those resources that were not suppression related. I mean, there was private forest, state forest, financial, and so forth. It was to implement the cohesive strategy, and so I think your answer is yes. That those resources would be available for all of that.
Plus, it gives a more stable workforce. They're not going to be, I'm working for them. The Forest Service went to all of their engine captains as full time. They have them year round, and so there's a promotion. There's something to join on ODF as a career path versus, next summer I think I'll go to work for Fish and Wildlife or something.
All right, we're gonna keep moving along here unless there's any.
So let me set the stage for the two of you, and kind of in the context of Jason now that he's gone. Senate Bill 1536, in my humble opinion, captures much of the energy of this group, which is fantastic to see how it plays out. But tactically speaking, you got to figure out what priorities are in that, and whether or not there are other instruments that can help those priorities get over the goal line. So we spent the last couple of weeks kind of splintering out a couple of the pieces and finding homes for them as amendments to other bills that increase the chance. So it's like taking 2 bites at the apple, to borrow from my grandmother's way of thinking. And that's in essence what we've done with transmission and with kind of a bundle of land use, and we're trying to find something about who pays, and we're trying to find a vehicle for financing it, for developing the financial plan. So we have those other activities going on. 2 of them have firmly landed, and Stefan's going to share one, and Mark's going to share the other. Representative Holvey's working on one for us, and we're working on a 4th. But the whole goal is to take some of those pieces, create another opportunity to narrowly get that issue over the, into the victory column, while we continue to push for the overall benefits contained in 1536. Okay, that's inside the building tactical strategy. Stefan.
And Senator, oddly, no impact yet, no fiscal on Bear Sugar's bill?
No. Their timing is now they'll start these fiscals now that the bills have been introduced. But yeah, I've been asking for that one for a while. So.
All right. So on the utility power line component, and maybe I'll come back to the conversation. You want Mark to go first, or?
Might as well stay with the agenda if you don't mind. So Mark, I think you're actually up next.
Holly, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. In the interest of time, as John mentioned, the land use components were broken into 2 shots at it, or I guess 2 different approaches. Holly, and working closely with Keith Kudick, the retired planning director of Douglas County, and AOC Susan Morgan, natural resource director, put together kind of a local government approach to Senate or House Bill 4050. So Holly's going to take off onto it. This is Holly Kearns. She's the Baker County and City Planning Director, and also a member of the Association of Oregon Counties Planning Directors Association. She's worked with Senator Golden and some of the others on the language. She's been up here testifying on behalf of it. So she's going to give a quick rundown and of some of the proposed language changes. Our goal, I guess I should kind of take this, the overall goal was to always remember that the purpose was to save lives. Because we could get so caught into the sausage here that we could go crazy on this. And then lives and health, the land and the economy of cities, counties, and the state. And not to lose that, but also to work very diligently to keep the variety of groups and individuals that are concerned, so that we could keep moving forward, figuring out that ultimately in the discussions we could sort this out so we actually had a product. Because as was mentioned earlier by Joe, we have a real diverse group of folks. There's some people, and I guess Senator Frederick said it also, said some people think we're going to clear cut everything. Other people say we're not going to cut anything and we're not doing enough. So this has been a real interesting challenge to keep the goal so we can keep moving in the direction, as I mentioned, but at the same time do this in an affordable way of making sure that the person on my left here, his organization feels comfortable, and reaching all the way out to, and I'm not sure that they're opposites, but the Oregon Home Builders Association. So we had to try and put this together. That was our perspective, that's our approach, and not to lose sight of the folks of Oregon and the land. So that's kind of a quick overview. Holly, take it away from there.
All right, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. So Commissioner Bennett had asked me to share some thoughts on the land use section of Senate Bill 1536, and I've incorporated some of my planning colleagues' reactions to the bill here as well. Overall, I think that the changes in the land use system that are suggested have felt like a lot to digest for everybody. And that's not surprising. We knew that that was a really big concept. The funding to implement the changes has been a major concern for folks, and I think will continue to be for everybody as we look for funding vehicles. But I think that really on the positive side, the idea behind the Senate bill has not seemed to cause very much concern, despite the fact that it's a really big change, and I think that's a really positive indicator. There were a few primary pieces that were identified by planners that could make a big difference in how the concept is implemented when it does move forward. I've quickly just summarized them in 5 bullet points. The first one is the Senate bill discusses different maps for the LCD and for the state fire marshal to base risk mitigation decisions on. Creating one map would create an easier handoff between the land use implementation at the development level and the long-term implementation of defensible space. And I think there's also an opportunity for cost savings there. And so trying to merge that language into one map, I think, would help alleviate a lot of concern. There was also some discussion about local governments would like the option to enforce defensible space long-term, but there needs to be some refinement in the roles between coordinating how defensible space is implemented through development and how it's implemented long-term, kind of on the fire side. The third one is DLCD is recognized as the agency holding the risk map, as Jason Miner had talked about. And a suggested amendment is adding some coordination with the cities and counties to that decision-making role for the maps and the mitigation decisions, since this will all be implemented at the local level. There was a piece about the building codes sections of the recommendation and the importance of engaging the Department of Consumer and Business Services, where the Oregon Building Codes Division lies, in that discussion as well. And then again, coming back to funding, there was a lot of discussion about what happens if funding isn't provided or ends up being pulled or reduced over time. Knowing that the vast majority of local governments don't have the financial ability to absorb all of the responsibilities laid out in the bill, at least as they're defined currently. So a big discussion about longevity, I think, is going to be part of the concern moving this vehicle forward. There are a lot of communities that are starting to engage in the discussion, and I think there are some opportunities to put a finer point on some of the big concepts, like how risk is defined and the logistics of implementation. But there's some work that remains to get there, and that's no surprise to anyone on the council. So at the local government level, these conversations are starting, and I think this is really a great start to moving the council's recommendations forward.
Does anyone have any questions for Holly or want to discuss it?
I think it's consistent with the land use recommendations all the way across.
Did you hear that, Holly?
I believe, this is Russ, I believe that getting to the heart of the financial issue, that this is not an unfunded mandate, really has to be clear, and that's a challenge back to the legislature, that we need to come up with a permanent funding source to make sure that we're protecting life and property. So, good work.
And there was a lot of, in the discussions with my fellow commissioners in Eugene, and I've informally with the League of Oregon Cities folks, that, you know, if this becomes an unfunded mandate, then it has to sunset, because the cities and the counties cannot absorb it. They just can't. And then we end up in, you know, a Senate Bill 360 type situation. We have some really good things, but nobody can carry it out. So there is a critical piece there that really has to happen. Also in this, and I made, this ended up unfortunately as the Bennett proposal, but it wasn't exactly that. I have to really thank Susan Morgan from the Association of Oregon Counties, who's assisted on this. The second piece was Senate or House Bill 4012. Sorry, Representative Marsh, I got it mixed up in the House and the Senate here. But anyway, that's a parallel legislative effort going on, which, if I guess not really being terribly familiar with this, looking at John, is that if 4050 doesn't quite make it through, this is a fallback for the next year. We're basically a group working with the Department of Land Conservation and Development would be putting together a robust approach for 2021. They'd be pretty much taking what Holly outlined, moving the ball to the 2021 session. What you see here is some revisions. I think the biggest concern going forward is that it is not an agency directed, but a cross-section, much the same as the Wildfire Council directed approach. And that way it would then cause, we would move forward. And that, if you look on page 2 here, it outlines a Wildfire Policy Committee. Almost everyone here has been a member of something that staff works on a whole year, brings it to you and goes, what do you think? And you're going, oh man, this is 1,000 pages, how can I absorb it? Where if we have the recommendation, and once again, I guess this is just a recommendation, is that we move it to a Wildfire Policy Committee within Department of Land Conservation, where Land Conservation serves as staff, because some of these issues transcend. Building codes, for instance, transcend the role of DCLD and others, and that we have a robust discussion and put together a legislative package that there is a comfort level felt by the cities, counties, the conservation community, along with others, and also Oregon Forest Industries, etc. And I don't want to spend a lot of time reiterating this, but going over it so that we have a package that at the 11th hour we don't discover some group that just says, I can't live with this. And that's really, if I was summarizing something, there was a greater comfort amongst the commissioners and some others that if it was a broad group that where DCLD served as staff, but yet the group drove the direction of this as following the Wildfire Council's policy and direction. It would be an implementation there. And so I guess that's probably a quick summary. Holly, do you have any other points that I left out?
Nope, nothing to add.
I guess if there's questions, you have kind of some draft language that was put together.
350,000 first.
I saw it.
Okay.
They're willing to be bold if there's resources on a sustainable level. They're cautious if there isn't sustainable funding. That's the bottom line. If you protect lives and property, if you have the resources, we don't, we can't. And that's the message to the legislature.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
I can go on and on, but that's just because I'm a politician. But anyway, seriously, thank you, and thank you to Susan, Keith, and Holly for all of their work in the sidelines. Carol.
Before you go away. Okay, so
You're
you
stuck
say
with me
this
for a
is sort
while.
of this is a fallback position?
I used the wrong term. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's some. You know, I live 393 miles from here. 393 miles from here. So I'm not sure of all the things, and sometimes I'm not even sure I'm in the loop. So, John, tell them what it is.
I think it's fair to say that what we're trying to do is find common ground from what the original proposal drafted by DLCD is and what this group has counter-proposed, if you will. And from talking to all stakeholders in this interest group, if you will, what I sense is a commitment to figuring it out so that we can put a process in motion that attempts to speak to the issues that Russ has challenged us to get our minds around.
But the bottom line is that if things don't move forward and you're offering an alternative that's got a 2021
Yeah.
timeframe.
Fair enough.
And a lot of it is going to come down to funding, as Russ suggests. So if we don't solve the funding question and other, then you're putting forward a backup plan for 2021.
Because Carol, from a practical matter, from an agency point of view, they feel they don't have the staff to devote to this, given their current staffing. So in essence, please okay one more staff person to dedicate her or his life to this subject for the next year, and here's the money to do it.
Good. Thank you. We'll have time, I think, at the end to talk further about any of these bills. So with that, Stefan?
I'll see if I can get us back on track. So I think good news on utility, power line, wildfire mitigation risk language. We're in pretty good shape through the council's discussions all last year and through the legislative effort. Good coordination with both publicly owned utilities, privately owned utilities. I think the language that's reflected in 1536 very consistent with the recommendations at the council. As Jason outlined, it's very comprehensive. Say, first must assess risk-based context where the risk is, develop plans to address that. But again, it goes anything from inspection levels, vegetation management protocols, other hardening investments that you would make, etc. And for a privately owned utility, you'd be required to present that to the commission. They acknowledge it, and you follow that plan. You have cost recovery. For a publicly owned utility, there's a different governing body network, and so that's been addressed in the legislation to kind of satisfy that concern. All those plans would be submitted to the PUC and coordinated with Department of Forestry as well as with Emergency Management Services, in that review. And part of that planning does include things like community outreach before, during, and after an event. And I can tell you to the conversation we were having earlier, there's been a lot of activity, at least with our various communities, to get out there and work with Emergency Management Services well in advance of the 2020 fire season. I was just down in Grants Pass a couple weeks ago and visited the county commissioners there, and we had a pretty big storm event that went through and powered out for up to 5 days for some customers. And just because of, frankly, the better engagement we've had as a result of a lot of wildfire focus, just the evident better coordination that's occurring even in storm events that are more routine. Red Cross, the state emergency management office, the local emergency management office, setting up warming shelters, etc. A lot of good things are coming out of just that better partnership in all those areas. So we'll be doing drills before the fire season with Emergency Management Services, as well as law enforcement is also participating in those efforts. So a lot going on, even though it's not codified in this legislation relative to impacting 2020. I think the work that the council's been doing and the engagement across sectors is showing up in tangible ways. But the legislation would require plans filed by the end of the year for a privately owned utility. That's ourselves, Pacific Power, Portland General, and Idaho Power. The other consumer owns will file their plans a year later by the end of 2021. So it's consistent with the comments John made earlier. Language is good in 1536, but there are other utility bills that we could lean on if we need to. Once mentioned with John. So for me.
Question. So it sounds like, Stefan, you feel pretty comfortable with the level of coordination and where the bill's going at the state level, federal level. As I understand, there could be some potential sticking points there about federal level.
Well, I think on the federal side, through the Medicine Electric Institute, that's a trade group for all the investor-owned utilities. There's very active engagement with all the federal agencies to address this risk. So I think we've got the most weight, if you will, of that combined industry-wide effort. We just met last week, creating a new coordinating council similar to what we've done for cybersecurity to address wildfire. And so the Department of Energy is sort of the house for all the other agencies, USDA, BLM, US Forest Service, DOI, to bring all those agencies together to address things like, for example, master permits. So to get in and do work on right-of-ways instead of having to go to very personalized, the 6 states we cover, you can imagine how many national forests, each one of those has its own myriad of local agencies. If we can have master permits that address that at the top, we can address all the O&M, operation and maintenance issues much more rapidly and effectively. So we're addressing that in California first, because that's where a lot of the momentum actually came out of issues that were realized there. That's now expanding, to other parts of the U.S. But I think our opportunity there is more to engage and be a partner as it relates to field treatment and other things that we're talking about in the council that are joined at the hip, if you will, in mitigating wildfire response.
I just remember our first meeting in Portland with the governor and the Department of Agriculture, and they said, if you have any issues, we're here to help. So
yeah,
we just need to make sure that they remember.
Yeah. No, we're staying in front of them. I'm pleased that the highest level of those agencies, they're engaging. It's another matter then to execute and work through the reality of those agencies.
Representative Marsh.
Yeah, Steph, you mentioned that CRU's having a different deadline, and I know they also had some other concerns around language.
Yeah.
Do you know if they've been accommodated or they have one?
That's my understanding, is that the current language is supported by all those parties.
Right.
Yeah, I might say just in a general sense to that issue, Representative, in the same spirit that you all reached consensus on recommendations led by the Pacific Core team, the whole family of utilities has reached a consensus of opinion on the language Representative Powers and introduced. So, way to go, AP.
So this is basically complementary to 1536.
Well, 1536 was forward and done. If for some reason that we're not to proceed, this is important language to get codified in this session.
Well, and to reiterate, if we hope to have as many shots at getting specific issues over the goal line as possible, you all identified dealing with transmission-related issues as one of your highest priorities. So we looked real hard to find another vehicle to take, in essence, what is contained in 1536, make sure it's working for all the utilities, and find another vehicle through amendment that could actually pass it into law.
And maybe to address Curtis's question earlier, there's no fiscal impact to the bill. It's all cost recovery comes through the utility mechanisms.
So next on the agenda is Senator Golden's going to present an overview of 1514 forest restoration. He's supposed to be here at 11. Let me suggest we take 5. And everybody be on your toes for when Senator Golden comes and joins us.
Thanks, guys. I don't like a well-oiled machine, Mr. Donald.
Thanks for getting us back down.
It's okay. It's all right.
Well, thank you everybody for rejoining us. Hopefully everybody is with us on the phone as well. Believe it or not, we're actually on time on the agenda, which I had my doubts this morning. And so with that, our 11 o'clock slot is up, and this is with Senator Golden, who has joined us ahead of a very, very busy week. So thank you for making the time here. I think everybody's very familiar with the committee that's been formed on wildfire in the Senate, and Senator Golden has been chairing that this past many months and has been extremely collaborative, working with members of the council, particularly me and obviously Jason. integrating our work as best he can with the council. So with that, I will turn it over to the senator. So.
Well, we have it all solved, I'd like you to know. Thank you for teeing it up, but we got it covered now. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Jeff Golden. I represent Senate District 3, which is most of Jackson County, the Medford, Ashland, Jacksonville area. Until just now, this council was kind of a rumor to me. It's the first time I've been to a large meeting. I've had one-on-one conversations with several of you. This is a remarkable body of work, a remarkable, in terms of the numbers of issues, that sort of holistic view, and the complexity of so many of the parts. And I just very grateful that you folks have invested the time and effort you have to bring it to this point, instead of having us show up here and go, so we got a wildfire problem, what are we going to do about that? So thank you very much. And I, it would be folly not to coordinate with your work after all you've put into it. So I have there is a new wildfire, just renamed, I'm happy to say. During the interim, it was called the Wildfire Prevention and Recovery Committee. I asked that it be renamed the Wildfire Reduction, not Prevention and Recovery Committee, hoping not to raise false expectations among Oregonians, and to be clear that wildfire is going to be part of our way of life in Oregon for certainly as long as all of us are around, and probably as long as there are Oregonians. This is a 5-person committee. My vice chair is Senator Bertschiger from Grants Pass, my geographic neighbor. Senator Frederick, who's served on this committee, is on the committee. Senator Przanski from Eugene, and also Senator Kim Thatcher are members of that committee. And we awaited most of your report to try to figure out how we should use our 3 committee bills. So that's the quota for the short session in committees. And understood early on that Jason and Matt would be working with the governor on a broader bill. I don't know if it's right to call it an omnibus bill, but one that really took quite a bit of your recommendations. And of course, sort of a threshold question is, how much can we realistically do in this short session? Some prioritization of the urgency of measures, and some realism about what we can and can't get done. Obviously part of the short session's work is to build foundations for a longer session's work, and we don't know which parts of what we do will do that, and which parts we can actually turn into law this time. So I have been in pretty continuous conversation with Matt and Jason over time to try to integrate our work, not duplicate, not let too much fall in the cracks. And where we are right now, I'll tell you very, very briefly about the 3 bills coming out of our committee. Senate Bill 1514 is what we've come to call the on-the-ground bill. And it came out of a concern of a few people, mine one, maybe I took lead on this, that with all the, we have a historic challenge here that is going to take a long time to comprehensively address, and that takes a lot of planning, a lot of building of organizational infrastructure, a lot of building of partnerships, fortifying of partnerships, figuring out over time what the funding model is, none of which we're going to do in 35 days. And having lived through the summer of 2018, now we're a year and a half out, there's so many Oregonians who want to see work on the ground. And we took it as one of our committee mandates to make sure that happened. And 1514 started as what we called a demonstration project. Let's do a modest number of sites and ask ODF to spend a lot of time thinking about where this work should happen, incorporate some of your recommendations in how the work gets done, try to maximize work with community collaboratives and with the federal government, and report back to the legislature for 2021 to set up a much larger request for fuel reduction and mitigation statewide. What can we learn about all that? And the governor and these 2 gentlemen said, well, actually, you might be thinking a little too small there. let's really ramp up mitigation and on-the-ground work as soon as we can. So we sort of dropped the name demonstration and are looking to infuse a lot of resource, the exact amount is not known right now, into fuel reduction work. I think Matt and Peter have been in discussion. We want the determining factor of how much we invest this calendar year on the ground in mitigation to be the size of the pipeline that we have. How much can ODF really administer well in such a short time? We are really asking for an unusually fast timeline to get boots on the ground. We want to work with collaborators. We also we've been having a discussion for a year about how workforce development can fit into all this. There's a lot of interest in getting younger people and other kinds of folks trained in forest restoration for the 20 to 30 to 40 year effort we're now embarking on. There are workforce issues, and we want to integrate that in as well. So that kind of leads me to 1515, Senate Bill 1515. This is a fairly simple bill that would establish a foundation that can solicit and collect funds primarily from the private sector, foundations and corporations who obviously have an interest, many of them, in climate and in the wildfire crisis here, but also to pair that with the interest that many have in workforce development and career opportunities for young people. As you probably know, we have a couple of forest-based workforce development programs now which have had a lot of success with small numbers of people. They are not well funded. We'd like, in the big picture, as we ask where's the funding for all this coming from, we'd really like to ask the private sector for help for well-designed programs that both accomplish ambitious goals for fuel reduction and for providing some career path training for young people. We've got the blueprints. We've sort of figured out what does and doesn't work in workforce development in the woods, and we want to scale that up with the help of the private sector. That's Senate Bill 1515. And our third committee bill, Senate Bill 1516, has the shorthand title of ODF modernization. Senator Bertschiger has done the work on that bill, and I'm actually looking forward to hearing him present it on Wednesday. I think the first two bills we'll start hearing today, and anyone's welcome at our committee meeting at 1 to 3 p.m. today. Senator Bertschiger, who has spent a career in the forest and in wildfire work, has a couple of particular ideas that he really wants to advance this session. One has to do with aerial resources for suppression, and that's under a lot of discussion. What is the most cost-efficient way? What are the weak points? Where do we need to strengthen the air resource? So he's looking at that, and he's looking specifically at his proposal at the moment is to make 50 part-time positions in ODF, fairly skilled positions, crew bosses, others with supervisorial responsibility in the woods during the fire season, make those full-time positions and deploy them in a number of ways. He particularly talks about consultation with private landowners about hardening and defensibility and forest management, because of course there is a major, your whole piece of work around community adaptation resiliency, while not reflected really in the first two bills I talked about, will obviously get a lot of attention in the other bills. And Senator Bertschiger would like to see some capacity with ODF to consult on the ground with that and with the state fire marshal. And I think I can, I guess I'll spend another minute on the broad dynamics. As you probably know, don't have to tell you this is challenging work. We are looking for some sound balances. We've gotten a lot of input from forest conservation groups who are wary of the mitigation and work on the ground over a broad landscape. I guess the extreme position, I've heard it from a couple people at least, and a couple organizations, is you've got this whole mitigation thing wrong. We don't need to do much on the ground. What we do on the ground needs to be entirely in communities and immediately around communities. Help people harden their properties and create defensible space and building codes. Nobody disputes that that's important. But you're like tilting at windmills thinking you're going to make much difference on the ground in fuel reduction. As I say, that's an extreme point of view. And then there's another point of view that's sort of on the other end of this continuum that says, let's reduce fuel and enter pretty much everywhere wildfire happens. And, I think it's going to be a task for all of us to try to encourage people to extend some trust into this process. And I know that some pretty smart people are trying to find balance points on that and other issues having to do with commercial timber harvest. And let us not carry too much baggage from 20, 25 years ago and try to get out there with a lot of reliance on the community collaboratives over the next few years who do generally enjoy a fair amount of trust in their communities, to find these balance points that may be nobody's ideal, but the size of this crisis and the urgency calls on us all to extend some trust as we try to find these difficult balances.
That's it?
That's pretty, we got it covered. Go home, your work is done. No, kid, not, that's not true.
I just want to reiterate our thanks for your willingness to take this on. And we did hear from Joe Furia, who chaired the mitigation committee earlier today, and he also raised a lot of these issues that you're discussing in terms of how do you implement mitigation and what is the role of timber versus public funding. Within public funding, how much, what's the responsibility of the individual landowners to treat their land versus the public benefits from the state that might warrant. So I think we're aware of the thorny issues that you've raised and appreciate your willingness to wade in. I'd like just to open it up to any other council members.
Senator, in our first meeting, a number jumped out at me that has really stayed with me last year that we've been together. And of the 1.6 million acres we burned in 17 and 18, 92% of it was on federal timberland in the state. And as we really keep those numbers in front of us, we realize what a challenge we have with a federal partner that lives 3,200 miles away. And it's just, I can't emphasize that enough. When the federal head of science for the U.S. Forest Service talked to us, he talked about just the continued need to not only focus on fuel reduction, but how threatened so many of our communities and cities would be if we didn't. And anyway, I just think that just brings such an unusual challenge as we try and solve things in this building, but remembering the partnerships that we're really challenged with here. And I just encourage you all to keep those facts firmly in front of you, as that was very eye-opening for me.
Yeah, thank you for that. It is maybe an unprecedented challenge for us. The good news is we have a congressional delegation who's very focused on this issue, and as a shared stewardship agreement kind of moves forward, it's going to address some of this. But short term, we have something that's pretty difficult, which is, you're right, I talked a little bit about Senate Bill 1514, the on-the-ground work, and how part of I didn't mention that there'll be a detailed report back to the legislature about what's discovered there. But when we look at the likeliest sites that'll be selected, and using the QRA and the 2.2 million acres that are already NEPA approved, which is a big hurdle. By definition, we're talking federal lands when we're talking NEPA. Where we are going to be making a request for state funds, some of which will be deployed directly on federal lands. And we understand there's going to be people who say, look at our, major fiscal needs XYZ right now, our urgent needs, and how can we justify spending money on state lands? Well, we justify it because we have, our state's kind of on fire here. And we need to keep working all of us need to be working with the federal delegation to, towards the principle that the owners of land should bear, as to the greatest degree possible, the cost of responsibly reducing wildfire risk on them. And we are, but in this next 35 days, we're going to have to move forward aggressively anyway. And what encourages me is how serious, especially our two senators are, how seriously focused they are on the very issue you're talking about. And thanks for bringing it up.
So, Senator, I want to parrot Matt just a little bit. I want to thank you, particularly as Representative Marsh, for making this a priority. You know, it takes a committee like this. We've been meeting for almost a year now to put together some stuff. But once we get done, it has to move up to the leadership level to do a lot of this with bills. And for you to take this on is a big thank you from us. And I know it's a heavy lift, and it's probably a heavy lift for 2020. It was probably a more heavy lift in 2021 to move this forward. But, you know, the journey of a great journey starts with one step, and your leadership in that Senate committee is a good step. And your enthusiasm and Representative Marsh's enthusiasm about moving something forward is to be complimented. So thank you.
Thank you, and you built a remarkable foundation. It would be folly to tackle this in a short session without what you've done.
So, well, thank you. I guess one not particularly well-formulated thought, and it's building upon what Mark was just saying, is at your last hearing in January, Senator, it was almost organic, where I think the need was very, widely recognized for restoration treatments. First of all, the crisis that we're under here in terms of fire, not just in Oregon, across the West, the need for restoration treatments and so forth, and for that matter, even the broader cohesive strategy. You haven't heard a lot of folks saying, boy, we should be investing in air filtration systems. Boy, we should be addressing our land use issues. I mean, it's just, we're not hearing a lot of philosophical feedback that's saying, oh, you're so alarmist and so forth. I mean, if anything, it's people are trying to add to the urgency that something needs to be done. But again, this organic discussion then suddenly becomes, how in the heck are we going to pay for this? Because it is, and some people describe it as a debt that's been accumulating year to year with the fuel loads that have been accumulating, concurrently with climate change that is also a debt in its own right. And these are converging to create this massive financial liability for the state. And so one of the things that we've talked about here this morning and throughout 2019 is the need to really examine a sustainable funding model. More broadly, not just on mitigation treatments, but on health systems and more broadly. So we are imagining that this would be work should the council be renewed. This is work that we would take on, and as we're doing that, I think it would be imperative that we would be working together with your committee. I'm assuming your committee, now that it's got a new name, means that it's getting renewed as well. Is that right?
As far as I know, unless you solve the wildfire problem. Yeah. And of course that's going to be a discussion that needs our revenue leadership in it as well. And part of the governor's bill, last time I saw it, was authorizing a third-party study on private property role in funding. As you know, that's been a controversy for some time. And I think as I've talked to different parties, we have pretty good consensus that it's time for a disinterested, qualified third party to look and make recommendations about the most equitable contribution from property owners, another thorny issue. There have been an examination of that. There's a lot of apples and oranges in the mix, and that's one part of it. Then, how much are we going, what kind of relationship are we going to build over time, especially with management of the federal lands? Will there be the political will do the risk reduction, the forest resiliency work that's needed over the next 20 years. There better be, because we know it can't be all on the backs of Oregon taxpayers. And then what can we ask Oregon taxpayers as a whole to bear? So that's critically important work. I'm really happy to hear it's going to be a focus of this group.
Anything further?
Senator, I want to thank you. For you, it's been an incredible journey to absorb the complexities of this. I remember our first discussions, and you've come a long, long way in this process, and it's taken a lot of human effort on your part. And Representative Marsh, you've been with us ever since the beginning on this, but you've really honed us down to the highest priority questions, and I just want to thank you for that. I wanted to remind you of one thing as I was looking over our federal partners. A lot of investment in building trust has hit the ground in Oregon over the last 15 years, and communities you could really depend upon where the science is emerging and evolving is in Bend, Ashland, Klamath Falls, and the Blue Mountains. I'm assuming you've heard that already, but the collaborative forest landscape restoration investments combined with the collaborative work involved is really getting those communities to a point where the science is telling them we like what we see, we want more of it, and they're ready to get to scale. And how you make a decision where to go next with those communities. At the same time, you balance the health and human services threats to property, personal property, public property. We have vulnerable hospitals, we have vulnerable roads, transmission, schools, and we have to be able to make some very tough decisions in the short session where those investments are going to be made. So as long as we keep the federal collaboratives going and the science being delivered and presented to you, I think we're going to build that trust over time. But you're right, there are people on all sides of that spectrum about whether we should allow that or not, but making sure the science is rigid is important. But I want to thank you for juggling all of this.
Well, and thank you, and your remarks bring up 2 points for me. One is a kudo to Rep. Marsh, who is my member of the House of Representatives. She represents other people too, but she represents me. And last session, she really pushed for some short-term infusion, and she's just really stuck with us, so thank you for that. And then, a whole area that I haven't talked about, it's not in our bills, you'll see it in the governor's bill, of course, is the whole area of involvement of local government, local communities. Commissioner Bennett's been critical on that, Mayor Russell. And, it's those who say it's argued to be the lowest hanging fruit. Let's get in especially with the specter of Paradise, California and all that. Let's do everything we can as quickly as we can there. And that's going to take, in terms of unprecedented letting go of old wounds, that's going to take really, really outstanding collaboration and listening between state government and local government that it hasn't always been true in the past. And, we're committed to that. And we have to do that. We have to do that hardening, that defensible space, that zoning and building materials work. And I really look forward to looking at that in the governor's bill and helping it any way we can.
So I just thought, Senator Golden, thank you so much for sitting here and the work you're doing as the mayor of Bend, as the chair of the Division of Wildfire Forest Project. I recognize all this body of work that's been developed throughout Oregon, especially in Central Oregon, integrated in policies and strategies, but really point to the models and the way to execute and get this stuff rolled out quickly and effectively for our entire state. So use us all as a resource and all the ways of the work we're doing here in the Wildfire Response Council as well as in our communities that can really feed and support and accelerate what our state needs now.
Thank you. There are witnesses to what you just said.
That's good.
Well, just echoing that, the senator came down and spent a great deal of time with commissioners in Eugene twice, 2 different days, and his commitment, your commitment, to making sure that we have a kind of a new relationship between local government and this building was really important as a takeaway, and I think it went a long ways to trying to start to build that relationship so we can get to some of these things that really, if you look at it as a citizen, you'd say, well, they are low-hanging fruit, but they're low-hanging only until everybody starts getting mixed into to the forest or to the orchard, I guess, in that sense. So thank you for that.
Sure, thank you both.
So that's a next agenda item that's not on the agenda, but Jason has recommended, and I think it's a great idea, that State Forester already review the requests from ODF, and if you'd like to stay with us for that.
About 10 minutes, I'd like to.
I think that would probably be a good use of our time together here, so thanks, Peter.
So we've been communicating this committee around emails around the financial oversight, forestry financial oversight, is trying to address the structural problem we have with large fire funding. And, you know, I know sometimes you get lots of emails and you might not see them, so I'll briefly characterize the problem. We start out large fire seasons with $10 million cash in hand to pay for large fire costs. That worked fine a decade ago when our large fire costs were $10 million. Since 2013, the average large fire cost has gone to $70 million. This is gross cost, and have ranged from anywhere from $20 million to $112 million. And so we're effectively being asked to be a bank. So it takes, under good circumstances, it takes 2 to 3 years at best to recover the majority of these gross over net costs from the federal government, FEMA, and other contributing agencies. So, and there's 5 different federal agencies we may be collecting from. Currently, we're carrying about $104 million worth of debt. We've invoiced about $53 million, waiting for payment, and we still have another $50 million to invoice. We are not structured like a bank, and we've hit the point where we're scheduled to run out of all of our general fund at the end of March. And so that would mean largely ceasing the operations of our agency in forest practices and relying on an only self-funding program, which is state forest. So it's a big impact. So we've done a cash flow projection, and we've requested $31 million of general fund to get our regular core programs through the end of the biennium. That's not counting, that's if we have no fire season. So I don't know what kind of fire season I will have, but I expect it will be at least low. So we requested another $20 million, which is the lowest we've had in recent past, to bring it to $50 million request. And then we were, DAS asked us to request $700,000 to pay for MGO, the outside consulting that's working for the Financial Oversight Committee. So that's our first request, $51,700,000 to get us through the biennium and pay for low fire season. When you actually see the request letter, which was sent in the email to you, you'll note that we've subtracted what the legislature's already allocated in the early balance bill, which is the money that they owe us for the 2019 fire season. So the second request is what happens if I have a large fire season. That's $112 million, and so we've subtracted 20 from that and made a second request for $92 million in case we have a severe fire season. So those are the 2 requests that have gone into the Legislative Fiscal Office and since we addressed to the co-chairs of the Ways and Means.
Might I ask, historically, how would you have paid for that large fire season? What were the tools you had available that makes this season a little bit different, or this year a little different?
Well, in previous decades, we always had $10 million. We had a $10 million from the Oregon Forest Land Protection Fund. They used to pay the first $10 million in cost, and the little spikes we could carry in our cash account, which include our state forest timber revenue funds. So we always had a reasonable reserve to mitigate that flow. As we got into the worst fire seasons, we were using treasury lines of credit, which were meant to be short-term lines of credit. And the treasurer at some point realized we're not talking about short-term debt that we're carrying. We're talking about consistently carrying a sum of debt all the time. And so we need a different instrument because Treasury can't continue to give us short-term lines of credit for a long-term problem. It's a quick summary of it. But that's what we had. What really finally precipitated it was a $60 million fire season followed by a $100 million fire season back to back. You know, and that kind of cost going into the second fire season before you've collected much of the last fire season, then the accrual builds up quite a bit.
And Peter, what was the fire season of 2019?
That was 40 million, or 35 million gross.
So it was on a small scale.
And then gives us perspective. Yes, we are happy with that season. If it happened a decade ago, my hair would be on fire because it's 3.5 times what our fire season cost a decade ago. So it is relatively small for 2013 on, but it's still, you know, if this is a future, we're way out of what was normal a decade ago. Yeah.
I think it would be helpful for people to understand, since we had a small fire season last year, and we just went through the 2-year biennium planning and budgeting process a year ago, why these requests, what happened to those requests were they made then, why are we coming back and needing a whole lot of money so short, such a short time through the biennium since we had a very modest fire season.
So we're still collecting on 2018 and 2017. We have a tiny bit left in 2016 and 2015. So the other thing that's accelerated is the number of transactions that we do in an average fire season. We've gone from 40,000 transactions to over 100,000 financial transactions in the peak of fire season, and we're managing that with the same size financial staff. We've been able to do some internal reallocation, but our system is just swamped. So we are actually more like 4 to 6 years in collections rather than 2 to 4. So we're behind. The consultant was brought in to look at our systems and upgrade them to modern systems, MGO, and they're doing that now. So, and when you think about, we have collected $6 million thus far from 2019, and that season ended 6 months ago. So covering costs start right away. And then the earliest payments we get are from the landowner, Oregon Forest Protection. It's 6 to 8 months to get general fund reimbursements. And then again, they only reimburse for net cost. And then the remainder is FEMA, which can take some length of time, up to 3 years. And then the federal government, U.S. Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Indian Affairs, we're having to collect from those.
So, Peter, am I inferring that the collections on the 17 and 18 seasons are going more slowly than you had anticipated a year ago? I think, if I understand Representative Marsh's question, is why didn't we know about this, sooner? So are we kind of getting surprised ourselves a little bit by the slowness of the?
We were certainly surprised. I didn't fully understand the limitations on the line of credit because we had been using the line of credits to carry us through in terms of cash. In general, our cash flow is very lumpy as well, both in terms of revenue in and payments out. And so when you look at it's a very, we have multiple funds. But yeah, so we actually are collecting faster now because we've made some process improvements. And we've accelerated our collections, but we still have the wait time. But yeah.
So Peter, thank you for the presentation. I must say that the systems that you're operating under in comparison to many other states, MGO coming on to help with an assessment will tell us that you're working with Band-Aids versus modernization techniques that other states have been able to enjoy for a long time. fact that you have this reality of the over 100,000 transactions you can bill. When you walk through your office and you look at the computer systems, none of us would want to be operating with what you have on the desks. At a nonprofit, I have stuff that is much faster, better connected than what you're dealing with. And it's a sad state of affairs that you're having to address it at the scale and scope. And I'm optimistic that the legislature will address this in a very pragmatic way. We as citizens need to make sure that you're focusing on protection of life and property and not billing with systems that just are not designed. And without the staffing, you need to be able to do the job. It's not going to take rocket science to solve this problem. It needs resources.
Although, the processes worked fine when we had a small fire season and went under the radar. But you're right, we do need to improve our processes, and we're really excited about MGO coming in. They were actually thinking they were going to help us get caught up with our invoice. The actual processing the invoice isn't the big bandwidth. A lot of this is cleaning up the communications between the relationships and sorting out who owes what. These fires are very complex when you have large fires with multiple owners and you have to reconcile.
And you're not the only state that have problems with the feds not delivering, particularly FEMA and Indian Affairs are just way behind in their payments.
And I think echoing on that, it not only affects ODF, but it affects the small rural fire departments. Probably Jim would echo, and if Les would here, he'd really jump in. FEMA, we have a fire, FEMA is going to pay them. These small rural fire departments expend 2 years' budget. The county, we ended up loaning money to the various, because they were going to go out of business because FEMA didn't pay for 3 years. And the counties are forced, and probably Mark, you've done it too. I mean, to try and keep our fire departments, there is just, it's not just ODF, but it affects that entire fire response because Jim's counting on them to come, and they're going, why would I go when we're not going to get paid? We don't even have any money. So it's a larger problem, but it affects the whole system because you lose that capacity. Plus, you lose that, that support in the mutual aid system. So there's a bigger piece, and the counties can't afford to be the bank just same. I mean, and sometimes in our case at the time, we took money out of our contingency fund because it was so critical. But I've seen it in at least a half dozen, and Jim, you probably could even echo it, but not to take up a lot of time. But I want to say that it isn't just an ODF problem, it's a fire service problem, and law enforcement too, because they were supposed to pay for the sheriff's office, and I don't even, it was...
I mean, FEMA's overwhelmed too, right? I mean, they weren't designed for this volume of activity either. I think what we heard is that other states are typically experiencing a 2-year turnaround. We're about double that. So we do have, some room, obvious room for improvement, but we're still going to be dealing with a 2-year lag from FEMA. I mean, at minimum, right?
And that's one of the things that I've asked MGO to look at, and that'll help begin to identify the problem, is looking at what is the long-term debt that you need to carry to be able to be successful at fire suppression. And not only what is the average long-term debt, what are the peaks and the flows. Once we know that, then, you can design a thoughtful system to fund that. But I'm glad you brought up the impacts, Jim and I have talked about here, the same thing impacts this agency. And I had not thought about the rural fire districts. A longer-term solution would include something to so that everybody's not trying to act like a bank to the partners that we're providing support for. So that was a really good comment.
So Peter, with your current financial model though, you have another big fire season, you just dig a deeper hole. Because if it's taking you 3 to 4 years to collect your accounts receivable, if you will, I mean, you're banking on a small fire season to balance your department budget. I guess my question is, what's the true way out of this situation, knowing you've got this 3 to 4 year backlog, you're behind on invoicing, and one more bad fire season and the hole gets deeper? That's one part of the question. The second part is all these things we've talked about sending your direction, truly the capacity in light of this situation, your capacity to really handle more than what you're already doing?
So, two things. One is you will never be out of the debt situation. That's why nobody assigns government goes into emergency management. You're expected to spend money up front and then recover it later. So even under good conditions of a 2 to 4 year recovery, we'll be constantly carrying some amount of debt that will be fluctuating up and down. So that's the first answer. We're carrying more than we should be right now, I will agree, because we're behind in payments. In terms of capacity, I think when I first came to this council, I showed you the number of overtime hours increase that we've had due to the increase in large fires. So I think I told you then I have a department built for a fire season a decade ago. So yes, I don't have the capacity for large fires. A holistic approach that you take, where we're investing in mitigation and we're investing in any number of other activities, requires capacity to implement it. The thing about that capacity in a militia approach is that we can use it during peak fire season for addressing large fires. But yeah, I have not been convincing about my request or need for additional fiscal analysts, business managers in the area, or aviation managers or any other personnel that I've needed to adapt to this kind of fire season. I think this report that you've done has changed the conversation in the legislature to a much more holistic conversation, and I really thank you for that work.
And I think it's not just an Oregon problem, but if you look at what Travis Medina, the figures that he gave us early on about the increase in the number of fires and the increase in costs and that, if you look at the state of Washington, look at Idaho, look at California, it's not just an Oregon issue. It's trending up for whatever reasons you want to determine. We are doing that, so it's not just an Oregon problem.
I'm just reminded that going into this short session, you really need to be grounding yourself with the latest climate reports. It's right here. We're going to have high fine fuel loads in the spring, followed by very, very dry conditions in the summer, which gets you back into fire seasons that were on the very high end, looking back into the 70s and 80s. And I'm not a climatologist, but it doesn't take rocket science. This is not going to be a pretty year.
We track energy release components, which is a combination of humidity, fuel moisture, any number of things. And if you look at the trends over the past 10 years, it's steadily increasing in the number of days at emergent energy release components that are high fire risk. And our climate mapping that we did on the future of fire risk in Oregon says the same thing. It's built on the climate model. We will expect to see increases in the susceptibility for large fires in Oregon increases over time. I think it's just happened sooner than most of the models suggested it would.
So, thank you, Peter. I do want to offer legislators any final questions for Peter? No. Okay, thanks. We're losing folks. We do have one sign up for public comment. So we have about 5 minutes left for council discussion. We originally scheduled 30. But I think that was probably going to take up a big chunk of it anyway. So we have about 5 minutes before we'll shift over to our public comment period. So I just want to kind of open it up for...
I have a quick thing.
Yep.
If the Wildfire Council is renewed, I would hope that there'd be some amount of money so that you could have at least one meeting that pay for your folks to travel over to the east side of the state. I think it's just important that you see the warm, dry forests and the rangelands, And I mean, I'm not asking for funds for me to travel, but I certainly am asking that if you could just work in one so that you can find out, yes, we do.
Yeah, no, I think our original designs last year were to have 3.
Well, I'd only asked for one.
Well, no, it was 3. We had one in east, one in central, and one in southwest. And purely due to budgetary reasons, we scaled back on all that. So I don't think there's any philosophical disagreement.
Well, I don't think there is. That was just a lobbying.
No, I think we would love to get out there, for sure. And I think particularly as 2020 should be more emphasized in public engagement and community engagement. That's the right way to do it. Yes, Carol?
Just a question on, as the work has moved into the legislative arena, one of the things that we, at least one of the things spent some time discussing, had to do with data collection, holding, where are we going to put the data, who's going to manage it. Do you feel like moving forward that some direction is in that, or are we still kind of trying to figure out, when to reinstate? Or, I mean, this is just sort of a pragmatic question. Who's going to pay for data collection?
Well, so a couple of things. One is that the governor's bill does recommend DLCD for housing the quantified risk assessment map, or the risk, whatever version we use as a tool. They already have you responsible for Oregon to explore. They have a way of working to make things more accessible to local communities. The work is done by the Forest Service in cooperation with partners. Will be a conduit to help getting that. In terms of monitoring, I think there will have to be in any of these projects investigative monitoring. In our federal forest restoration, we have always contracted with ecosystem workforce for third-party monitoring to demonstrate the effectiveness or lack thereof of that program, because it was a new program, and we wanted to go back and say, here's what we've accomplished, where we've accomplished it, what impact have we had on jobs. I think moving forward, we need to put in the administration of it the money to pay for third-party monitoring. And then one of the things that we're doing under stewardship, the stewardship agreement is working to develop a set of agreed-upon indicators or monitorings of outcomes we're trying to achieve. Again, in terms of complete data management systems, I'm kind of holding my breath until we have the investment in our statewide IT infrastructure to support that.
So with that, I think we're going to move into public comment.
Thank you.
Mr. King, I'd invite you to.
As they say,
yeah.
Now for something totally different.
Although I think you passed away this year, didn't you?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Mr. King, if you wouldn't mind, for those on the phone, identify yourself and your affiliation.
You bet. I'm Jim King. I did get a memo copied, made by Sherry's office, so that tells you a little bit about who we are. I'm the guy in Camp Truman who proved that the fire was arson, and we recently have a proof of that. We hacked the Forest Service records, and there are 177 lightning strikes in that area around B&B, none of which, and it shows right on here, none of which were even close. So now we're talking about a whole change in the paradigm, and we're not happy. One of the things we're doing is we're not happy that the federal legislators, Merkley and Wyden, notwithstanding their liberal politics, have not done anything about the policies that we propose. We're proposing 3 things that will prevent that kind of stuff in the future. 1, the Forest Service and the state should not be able to investigate itself. Secondly, that if there's protections on a piece of property, like wild and scenic, wilderness, it stays protected even after fire. Because right now what's going on all over the country is people that burn things down and then build roads in and log. There was a group in Bright Bush who had a song about light it, fight it, and then log it. And it was a cute song. They sang it at our conference. It was kind of neat. And third is one of kind of internal thing. The Forest Service said that the fire funds for fire prevention and suppression should go back to the local districts, because right now that money goes to the region and get all politics. So those are the three things we're asking. The sheriff is going after the person who murdered Sokol. We're going to happy to come back and talk when that fits. It's a little teeny niche, but nonetheless important. I think there's a lot more intentionally fire starts than you would imagine. The natives do that all the time. They have a powwow coming up, they light a little fire, they go out and get paid for what they do, and then they go to the powwow. I worked for Caldwell for briefly. So there's just some things to talk about whenever it fits. Yeah. As a consultant, I always looked at a couple things. Are the right people in the room? Do they have the right agenda? Do they have leadership? Bingo, bingo, bingo. You guys are fabulous. I can't tell you how excited I am to come down. In case you hadn't noticed, passing this on. But I'll come back and do that. And if you want me to sit as an ad hoc person, I'd be happy to for that discussion. But you can decide. I just thanks for having me. And there is a brochure which we called our provocative thing. It talks about our goals, who we are. A quote from Kitzauer, Van Jones, a bunch of heavyweights. And this also talks about the people who we contacted who were helping, including Kennedy, Kitzauer, Van Jones, and others. So thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this. I saw the governor. I said, what you're doing is great. I think she knew what I was talking about. I think she did, actually. And Sherry, people got this thing typed up for me in about 10 minutes. And I'm kind of enterprising and kind of aggressive, as you may have noticed. So anyway, good luck. I'll be happy to come back. And
appreciate you joining us very much. Okay, thank you.
I saw this in the Ben boat, and I thought, too good to be true. Too good to be true. I've carried this thing for so long. Anyway, there's a bunch of people in Camp Sherman who are really, really excited about what you're all doing.
You're very lucky to live over there.
So.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. King. So we're gonna. Well, it depends on what happens here. I want it noted we're in under the noon. We are keeping. We're keeping our track record. One thing I do, since we have 3 minutes here, one thing I do want to point everybody's attention to is, I hope we do get, renewed. If we do, I suspect over the next few months there's going to be a significant discussion on how we integrate our work with the shared stewardship agreement. So this is something that Linda, Lynn, and Regional Forester Casamasa, together with Peter and Jason, are leading and kicking off, and it's very encouraging. The governor is actually going next week?
End of the week.
End of
Friday.
this week? Yeah. To meet with Purdue?
Hubbard? He's going to meet with Vicki Christensen, Chief of the Forest Service, Sonny Purdue, and
Hubbard.
Tim Hubbard.
Undersecretary.
So,
Interior as well.
So shared stewardship was something that was signed last August, kicked off the prior December, and you get the feeling that right now the gears are starting to really kind of go. So hopefully we'll have some good updates there. I just want to say again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to Joe. Ken drove all the way up here from Medford. Appreciate that very much. It was a really good meeting. Mr. King, thank you for joining us as well. So wish everybody the best. Hopefully we'll see you. Sure.
What's your desire as a committee? Do you, when we have questions, like right now, there's going to be a lot going on.
Yep.
We just rely on our own devices to figure out who to contact. Do you want to have? I mean, do you want calls on every?
Yeah, call me or email me. Call me or email me, and I don't mind playing dispatcher. A lot of it will go to John, but yeah, for sure. Just reach out to me directly.
I would echo that. I mean, I think John, John is, I think has been fielding a lot of that kind of outreach. Matt, and I will give you my card and my cell. The reality is, John and Matt are better at getting a hold of me than I am at getting a hold of myself. So.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. See you at the hearing if you can make it.
1 o'clock.
Yes.
Is she meeting on Friday or is she meeting?